Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really focusing our gaze on the very architecture of our social world. We're trying to pull apart those fundamental, often invisible forces that structure, your daily life.
Yeah, everything from that instant judgment you make about a stranger
Right.
to the choices you make when you're, say, part of a crowd.
Exactly. Our subject today is social psychology.
That's right. It's this fascinating subfield that explores how our individual thoughts, our feelings, our behaviors, they're all profoundly shaped by interactions with others.
And even just the presence of others,
Yeah,
right?
no, absolutely. Just knowing someone else is there can change things. It's really the science of understanding why we can be such radically different people when we're alone versus, embedded in a group.
And for you, our dedicated listener, the mission here is to get a shortcut kind of to fluency in this area.
Yeah, we want to decode the complex rules, the inherent biases that govern everything.
Everything from like instant attraction to maybe why certain political messages persuade us.
We're basically looking for the operating manual for social engagement.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, to start, I think we have to look at the most foundational element, those split-second decisions we make about the people around us.
Right.
We call this the architecture of judgment, or maybe more simply, how we perceive others.
Okay, let's unpack this core process then. We're constantly engaged in what's called social perception.
Exactly. It's the act of forming impressions, judgments, attitudes about our whole social environment.
And a key part of that is impression formation, just developing that initial, fundamental opinion of a person. So how quick are these initial moments? Are we talking seconds, minutes?
Much faster. The research is actually startling. We form first impressions so quickly, it's almost unconscious.
Wow.
Yeah, we're talking judgments made literally in a fraction of a second. Milliseconds, really.
Milliseconds.
Seriously. You look at a person and bam, you immediately categorize them across a whole spectrum of traits. You're often assessing things like trustworthiness or competence almost instantly.
That speed is just astonishing. It's just some kind of powerful, maybe primal mechanism at work.
It does. But here's the catch, the caveat that makes this so important.
Okay.
These rapid first impressions, they are not necessarily accurate.
Okay. So speed doesn't equal accuracy here.
Not at all. In fact, the source material really points out that judgments we make based solely on a person's facial features, that instant visual scan, often lead to perceptions that are just flat out inaccurate.
That feels like a real psychological friction point, doesn't it?
It really is. We have this incredibly fast tool, presumably for quick assessment, maybe for survival back in the day.
Right. Friend or foe.
Exactly. Yet that tool is highly prone to error when we're just relying on, say, visual cues in a modern context. And the problem gets worse because once these impressions are formed, they become remarkably sticky.
Sticky. You mean hard to change?
Extremely hard to change. They're long-lasting and notoriously difficult to revise, even when, a person provides ample evidence, maybe over multiple interactions, that contradicts that initial snap judgment.
Why is that? Why the resilience? Why do we clung so tightly to a potentially faulty first impression? Even if, like you said, we meet the person 5 times and they behave totally differently each time.
Well, it seems to come down to cognitive structuring, specifically something called social schemas.
Schemas. Like mental frameworks.
Exactly. Think of an impression as a type of social schema. It's a mental framework you construct about that person based on that first encounter.
Okay.
Once that framework is built, you kind of stop being objective. You start filtering all new incoming information about that person through your earlier impressions.
So the schema acts like a filter.
Precisely. If they do something positive and your initial impression was negative, you might dismiss it as, an anomaly or just situational luck. Anyone would have done that.
Right. Or they must want something.
Exactly. But if they do something negative, it confirms your schema perfectly. See? I knew they were unreliable all along. This self-reinforcing filtering process is really what guarantees their persistence.
Okay, so the schema filters the information. And if schemas are the filter, then stereotyping must be one of the most powerful things, like pouring into that filter initially.
Oh, absolutely. Stereotyping is defined as this tendency we have to characterize all members of a specific social group as having a common set of characteristics.
It's the ultimate cognitive shortcut, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
Because if you can just categorize a person into a known group based on age, race, profession, whatever, you instantly load them up with all the associated prejudged characteristics of that group according to your stereotype.
And the research really highlights the critical dangers here, doesn't it?
It does. Stereotypes heavily influence our first impressions. They're extremely resistant to change, as we've said. And critically, they can cause significant damage to intergroup relations.
And maybe most disturbing is how they get used, consciously or unconsciously, to justify existing social inequities.
Yeah, consider the mechanism there. If
Yeah.
you hold a stereotype, let's say, that a certain group is less competent, right?
Yeah.
And that group happens to be maybe socioeconomically disadvantaged. Well, the stereotype provides a ready-made, internal, or dispositional explanation for that disadvantage.
Ah, so you think they're poor because they're incompetent.
Exactly. Instead of acknowledging potential systemic barriers or situational factors they face, it becomes this kind of circular reasoning that maintains the comfort of the status quo for some, while reinforcing the negative stereotype itself.
It really sounds like a closed system then. The initial, maybe flawed judgment dictates how all future data gets interpreted.
Pretty much.
Okay, but let's look at a couple of other factors mentioned. First, how can we actually make ourselves look better in that first impression? Is there anything we can do?
Well, there's a relatively simple mechanism, personal disclosure.
Just sharing things about yourself.
Yeah, generally we form a more favorable impression of people who share some personal, genuine information about themselves. It doesn't have to be deep, dark secrets, just something authentic.
Why does that work?
It seems to signal vulnerability and trust. That act immediately helps foster a warmer, more positive schema around that individual. It makes them seem more human, more relatable.
Okay, that makes sense. Now moving to the consequence side. Once that impression, good or bad, is set, you mentioned it doesn't just sit there passively.
Right.
It actively shapes reality through something called the self-fulfilling prophecy, or SFP.
Yes, the self-fulfilling prophecy is basically an expectation that actively helps bring about the expected outcome. It's quite powerful.
Can you give an example?
Sure, let's use an office example.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a manager and you form the initial impression that a new hire is, let's say, lazy or unmotivated.
Okay, maybe based on a flimsy first impression.
Right. Because of that belief, you might subconsciously start micromanaging them, or you might assign them less challenging, less engaging work. Maybe you even fail to provide the resources or support they'd actually need to succeed.
So your behavior, driven by your internal belief, changes how you treat them.
Exactly. And because you treated them as if they were lazy, maybe they get demoralized, they disengage, they don't get the chance to show initiative, they might end up actually underperforming.
Ah, so their eventual poor performance confirms your initial, possibly false impression.
Precisely. And you totally miss the fact that your own managerial actions might have actually created or contributed significantly to that situation. That's the powerful and often invisible feedback loop of the SFP in action. It's quite sobering when you think about it.
Okay, so if impressions are about who a person is, the next big area, attributions, seems to be about why they do what they do.
That's a great way to put it. We're constantly acting like amateur psychologists, aren't we? Trying to figure out the reasons behind every action or event we observe.
Yeah, why did they do that? Why did that happen?
And attribution is basically our assumption about those causes.
Okay, so what kinds of causes do we assume?
Well, fundamentally, we're always choosing between two main types of explanations for behavior. First, we have dispositional causes.
Dispositional,
Yeah,
meaning internal.
exactly. Relating to the internal characteristics, the personality traits, motivations, or abilities of the individual involved.
Then the other type.
The other type is situational causes. These point to external factors, things like environmental pressures, luck, the context, or specific circumstances.
Let's use that classic example. The pizza delivery person is late.
Huh. Okay.
If I choose a dispositional cause, I'm judging the person, right, I'd say.
You'd say something like, he's late because he's lazy, or he's a reckless driver who doesn't care about his job. You're blaming his internal character.
Right. But if I choose a situational cause,
Then you're judging the environment or the circumstances. You might say, oh, he's probably late because there was a huge accident blocking the main road. Or maybe the restaurant was slammed tonight, totally understaffed, and his delivery got delayed waiting for the food. The cause is external.
what's really fascinating here, though, is how quickly we seem to abandon objectivity in these judgments.
Oh, completely. Our attributions are just riddled with cognitive biases. They constantly push us towards one type of cause or the other, often regardless of the actual evidence available.
And you mentioned the undisputed champion of these biases?
Yes, the fundamental attribution error, or FAE.
Okay, what is that exactly?
The FAE describes our deep-seated, pervasive tendency to attribute other people's behavior primarily to their internal dispositional causes.
So blaming their personality.
Right, while simultaneously ignoring or at least significantly underestimating the role of powerful situational influences that might have been acting on them.
So if a colleague, say, snaps at me in a meeting,
Your brain's instant default because of the FAE is likely to be, wow, they're hostile, or they're so unprofessional, an internal attribution.
instead of considering,
Instead of considering, maybe they just received some terrible personal news right before this call, or maybe they're under immense pressure from another project. We focus on the person, not the situation they might be in.
that seems like a major source of misunderstanding in daily life.
Huge. And it gets even more interesting when you look at culture.
How so?
Well, the sources indicate a pretty significant cultural context effect here. People in highly individualistic cultures, places like the US or Western Europe, where personal autonomy and individual achievement are really emphasized,
Yeah.
they are significantly more likely to commit the FAE. They're kind of primed to see individuals as the sole architects of their own fate. Whereas people in more collectivistic cultures, many East Asian cultures, for example, which emphasize group harmony, social roles, and context, they're much more likely to consider the situational pressures first when explaining someone's behavior.
That's a really important distinction. Okay.
Yeah.
So if the FAE is how we tend to judge others, how do we judge ourselves?
Well, that's where the actor-observer effect comes in, and it reveals a pretty powerful double standard.
How does that work?
The actor-observer effect is essentially the FAE flipped on its head when the self is involved. When we are the actor, the one performing the behavior, we tend to attribute our own actions primarily to situational factors.
So if I snap at a colleague,
You'd likely say, oh man, the deadline pressure just made me do it, or I haven't slept in days. You blame the situation.
but when we're the observer, watching someone else do the exact same thing,
We immediately jump back to the FAE and attribute their behavior to their disposition. Wow, they're just a really high-strung person, or they clearly have anger issues.
why the difference? Why the double standard?
Well, one theory is about perceptual salience. When we're acting, the situation around us is more visually and psychologically prominent. We see the external pressures acting on us.
Right. I'm aware of the traffic jam making me late.
Exactly. But when we're observing someone else, they are the most salient object in our field of vision. They fill our attention, so we naturally attribute the cause to them, the person, rather than the less obvious surrounding context.
Okay, that makes sense. And this self-protective tendency seems to reach its peak with another bias you mentioned.
Yes, the self-serving bias. This one is very specific.
Also,
It's the specific attributional bias, where we routinely take credit for our accomplishments and successes,
attributing them to.
attributing them to our own internal factors, our talent, our ability, our hard work. I aced that exam because I'm smart.
Right, but what about failures?
Failures or disappointments. We explain those away by attributing them to external causes beyond our control.
Like,
I failed the exam because the questions were unfair, or the teacher didn't explain it properly, or I just had bad luck that day. Never our lack of ability or effort.
the function seems pretty obvious there.
Oh, completely transparent. It helps bolster our self-esteem and protect our ego from taking too many hits. It feels better to blame the world than ourselves.
It definitely seems like a critical psychological survival mechanism.
It likely is. However, once again, the source material notes some interesting cultural differences.
With the self-serving bias, too.
Yes. While it's very widespread in Western individualistic cultures, it's found much less frequently, or is sometimes even inverted like a modesty bias in many East Asian cultures.
It's really inverted.
Yeah, in some collectivistic contexts, maintaining group harmony and appearing modest might be more valued than individual self-enhancement. So public self-praise might be discouraged, and sometimes even public self-criticism after success might occur to share credit or downplay individual achievement.
Wow, so even the way we protect our self-image is highly shaped by our cultural context.
Absolutely. It tells us these biases aren't just hardwired universals. They're modulated by cultural learning and values.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We've talked about explaining actions. Now let's move to how we evaluate the world around us. attitudes.
Right. An attitude is essentially a consistent evaluation or judgment. It's about liking or disliking something, a person, an object, an issue. We all hold thousands of them about everything.
You said they aren't just simple judgments.
No, they're generally understood to be these three-pronged structures. Psychologists often talk about the ABC model of attitudes. Yeah. A is for affective component, the emotions, our feelings of liking or disliking. B is for behavioral component, our inclinations to behave positively or negatively toward the attitude object. And C is for cognitive component, the set of cognitions or beliefs we hold about it.
Okay, can you give an example using that ABC model?
Sure. Let's take your attitude towards, say, recycling.
Go.
Your cognitions might be beliefs like recycling reduces landfill waste and it helps conserve resources. Your affective component might be feeling good or virtuous when you recycle and maybe feeling guilty if you don't. And your behavioral component is the inclination to actually sort your trash and put items in the recycling bin.
So beliefs, feelings, and actions all tied together.
Ideally, yes. They tend to align to form a consistent attitude.
Where do these attitudes come from? Are we born with them?
Mostly no. They're overwhelmingly acquired from our social environment.
Such as?
Parents, teachers, peers, our own personal experiences, and increasingly, the media play huge roles. While there's some research into temperamental predispositions or subtle genetic influences on tendencies towards certain attitudes, for the most part, attitudes are learned, socially transmitted concepts.
Okay, so we learn these attitudes, but sometimes what we believe seems to conflict pretty violently with what we actually do.
Ah, yes, that internal friction.
That leads us right into one of the most powerful motivational engines in social psychology, doesn't it?
Indeed. Cognitive dissonance theory, Leon Festinger's classic idea.
What is dissonance exactly?
Dissonance is that feeling of psychological discomfort, that mental tension or unease that's created whenever there's an inconsistency between two thoughts we hold, or more commonly between one of our attitudes and one of our behaviors.
And that feeling is unpleasant.
Very unpleasant. So unpleasant, in fact, that it strongly motivates people to change something, either the attitude or the behavior or how they think about them, in order to reduce the dissonance and achieve a state of consistency or consonance again.
Okay, let's use an example. Say, I strongly believe in environmental preservation. That's my attitude.
Right. Strong pro-environment attitude.
But I drive a massive gas-guzzling SUV to work every single day. That's my behavior.
Okay, clear inconsistency there between the attitude, save the planet, and the behavior, drive a gas guzzler. That creates dissonance.
So I feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Guilty, maybe.
Exactly. That's the dissonance motivating you. To resolve it, you have to change something. Now, quitting the driving habit, selling the SUV, that might be difficult, costly, inconvenient.
Yeah, probably not going to happen easily.
So changing the attitude or adding new beliefs is often the psychologically easier path.
How would I do that? How would I change the attitude?
Well, people employ specific resolution strategies. You might, number one, actually change the behavior, sell the SUV, start taking the bus. That directly removes the inconsistency.
Okay, the hard option.
Right. Or number two, you might change the attitude or belief. You might start thinking, hybrid cars are actually too weak for my long commute, or the impact of my single SUV is really negligible in the grand scheme of things.
Downplaying the importance of the attitude.
Exactly. Or number three, you could trivialize the inconsistency itself. Yeah, I drive an SUV, but it's really not that big a deal. Or, number four, and this is quite common, you might add new consonant cognitions, new beliefs that support the behavior and outweigh the dissonant ones.
Quite.
Like telling yourself, okay, I drive a gas guzzler, but I meticulously recycle 5 times a week, I donate to environmental charities, and I installed solar panels. So overall, I'm still a good environmentalist.
You bury the dissonant act under a pile of consonant ones.
Wow. So dissonance theory basically shows how we rationalize or justify our actions after the fact just to maintain a consistent and positive self-concept.
That's a huge part of it. It's a powerful engine for self-justification, absolutely. So if we understand that dissonance often makes people resistant to changing their behavior because they'll just change their attitude instead, how do we successfully persuade someone to change their mind or attitude about something?
Well, that brings us to persuasion models. A very influential one is the elaboration likelihood model, or ELM.
Elaboration likelihood. What does that mean?
It basically refers to the probability, the likelihood that the person receiving the persuasive message will put cognitive effort into thinking deeply about it, into elaborating on the arguments.
Okay, and that likelihood depends on?
It depends mainly on their motivation and their ability. Are they interested in the topic? Is it personally relevant to them? Do they have the time and mental energy to focus? If the answer is yes, then elaboration likelihood is high.
And if elaboration is high?
They process the persuasive message through what the ELM calls the central processing route.
Central route, meaning focused on the core message.
Exactly. This is the route you want people to take if you're selling, say, a complex financial product or arguing for a serious policy change. You need the recipient to carefully attend to the actual content of the message, the logic, the strength of the arguments, the evidence, the facts themselves.
And attitude change through this central route is?
Usually stronger, more enduring, and more resistant to later counter-persuasion. It's based on real thought.
Okay, but what if the person isn't motivated or able to think carefully? What if elaboration likelihood is low?
Well, if the recipient is, say, distracted or disinterested, or the message feels low relevance to them, then elaboration is low. They process the information through the peripheral processing route.
Peripheral, like around the edges.
Exactly. Here, people don't focus on the message content. Instead, they focus on simple, easy-to-process cues that are not centrally related to the arguments, things in the periphery.
What kind of cues are we talking about?
Things like the attractiveness, credibility of the source. He looks trustworthy, she's famous. The sheer number of arguments presented, even if they're weak, or emotional appeals, does the message make them feel good?
This sounds like, well, like most advertising.
It is. This is pure peripheral route persuasion. It's why advertisers use beloved celebrities, a peripheral cue of likability, to sell products like laundry detergent or cars, even though the celebrity likely knows nothing about the product's actual features.
So they're hoping the viewer, may be distracted while watching TV, processes it peripherally.
Precisely. They hope you associate the positive feeling you have toward the celebrity, the peripheral cue, with the product itself. This can create an attitude change, but it's often temporary, superficial, and easily changed later. Still, it can be very effective for triggering immediate action, like buying the product.
And you mentioned specific variables that influence persuasion regardless of the route.
Yes, the classic variables are always at play. The source of the message, they need to seem credible, expert, trustworthy, likable, and often similar to the recipient. The message itself, how is it framed, are emotional appeals used effectively. And characteristics of the recipient, like their intelligence, their existing mood, their age, their prior beliefs, these all influence susceptibility to persuasion.
Okay, we've covered how we judge individuals and how our own minds work with attitudes and persuasion. Now let's explore the dynamics of how we actually interact with others, starting with attraction.
Right. Attraction being those feelings of liking for others, thinking positive thoughts about them, and having inclinations to act positively toward them.
What are the key drivers? What makes us like someone?
Well, the first factor, and one that's often underestimated, is similarity.
We like people who are like us.
Overwhelmingly, yes. We are strongly attracted to people who hold similar values, attitudes, beliefs, even similar backgrounds or levels of attractiveness.
Why is similarity so powerful? Is it just about having things in common to talk about?
That's part of it, finding common ground. But it serves a deeper psychological function, too. Self-concept validation.
Validation, how so?
When someone who is similar to you also likes you or agrees with you, it validates your worldview, your life choices, your sense of self. It essentially says, hey, you're okay. Your way of seeing things is right. That's inherently rewarding and makes the relationship feel good.
That makes sense. Okay, what else drives attraction?
Well, then there's the factor we can't really ignore, physical attractiveness.
Right. Looks matter.
They do. Research consistently shows it's a key factor in initial attraction, whether we're talking about forming friendships or especially seeking romantic partners.
Is beauty universal, though? Or is it all cultural?
That's a debate. Some researchers argue certain features, like facial symmetry, might have a degree of universal appeal, possibly because they signal genetic health from an evolutionary perspective. But it's absolutely vital to recognize that cultural norms and learning play a huge role in dictating much of what is considered attractive in a particular time and place. So the perception of beauty is highly flexible and culturally shaped.
Got it. What's next on the list?
Proximity. Simple, yet incredibly powerful.
Just being near someone.
Yep. You can't like someone you never meet or interact with. Being geographically close, living in the same dorm, working in the same office, sitting near someone in class dramatically increases the chances of interaction. This leads to familiarity, And familiarity often breeds liking. It's the mere exposure effect.
But proximity can cut both ways, right?
Absolutely. It's a double-edged sword. If your initial interactions with someone nearby are negative, that same proximity just increases the opportunities for conflict and can lead to stronger dislike. Nearness amplifies whatever is there.
Okay. And the last factor.
Reciprocity. This is really fundamental to social interaction.
Liking people who like us back.
Exactly. People are generally attracted to others who show liking for them. If someone treats you well, compliments you, does favors for you, you are strongly inclined to respond in kind. It creates this positive reinforcement loop that builds attraction.
So the advice to play hard to get is bad advice.
Mostly, yes. Reciprocity usually wins. Although,
Yeah.
there's a small caveat. For romantic attraction specifically, some research suggests that playing slightly hard to get, creating just a little bit of uncertainty, may sometimes increase perceived value or make you hard to forget. But generally, showing genuine liking is the more reliable path. Too much game playing often backfires.
Okay. Now, when attraction deepens, especially romantically, we often talk about love. You mentioned Sternberg's model.
Yes, Robert Sternberg's triangular model of love. It's a very influential way of conceptualizing love. He proposed that love isn't just one thing, but can be understood as arising from three distinct components and their various combinations.
What are the three components?
The 3 points of the triangle are intimacy, passion, and decision commitment.
Okay, let's break those down. Intimacy is...
Intimacy refers to the emotional component, that feeling of closeness, connectedness, the warmth in a relationship. It involves sharing personal thoughts and feelings, giving and receiving emotional support, that deep bond and attachment.
Got it. And passion.
Passion is the motivational component, often the driving force in the early stages. It encompasses intense physical attraction, sexual desire, excitement, that feeling of being in love.
Okay. And the third, decision commitment.
This is the cognitive component. It actually has two aspects: the short-term decision that one loves the other person, and the longer-term commitment to maintain that love and the relationship through challenges over time.
So it's a combination of these three that defines different types of love.
Exactly. Sternberg argued that different relationships involve different mixes of these three. For example, if you have high intimacy and commitment, but passion has faded, that's companionate love.
The kind you might see in very long-term marriages or deep friendships.
Precisely. The bond and commitment are strong, but the initial fiery passion isn't the main feature anymore.
What about other combinations?
Well, if you have passion and commitment, but you lack deep intimacy, maybe people who get married very quickly based on intense chemistry without really knowing each other deeply. Sternberg called that fatuous love. It might not last if intimacy doesn't develop.
And if you only have passion?
That's infatuation. High intensity, but lacking the intimacy and commitment for a lasting relationship. The ideal, according to Sternberg, is consonant love, where all three components, intimacy, passion, and commitment, are present and strong. Though maintaining that balance over time is the real challenge.
That's a really useful framework. Okay, moving from connection to contribution, let's talk about helping behavior, or altruism.
Right. Helping is a form of what psychologists call pro-social behavior, basically, any action intended to benefit others. The big question is, why do we sometimes sacrifice our own time, resources, or even safety for others?
Are we purely selfless sometimes, or is there always something in it for us?
That's the core debate. See, Daniel Batson proposed a crucial distinction between two potential motives for helping. On one side, he argued, we can have genuinely altruistic motives.
Meaning
A pure, unselfish desire to help someone else, driven solely by empathy and concern for their welfare, without any expectation of getting something back in return. Helping for the other person's sake alone.
Okay. And the other side of the coin?
The other side, and perhaps the more common driver, according to some theories, involves self-centered motives, also called egoistic motives.
So, helping for our own benefit.
Essentially, yes. Here, we help to gain some kind of benefit for ourselves. This could be concrete rewards like praise, recognition, or maybe a future favor owed. Or it could be psychological, helping to make ourselves look good, to boost our self-esteem, or very critically, helping simply to alleviate our own negative emotional state.
Like feeling guilty if we don't help.
Exactly. Helping someone in distress can reduce our own feelings of guilt, anxiety, or discomfort caused by witnessing their suffering. So even if it looks selfless, the underlying motive might be to manage our own emotions. The debate about whether true altruism exists continues.
Okay, beyond the motive, what situational factors influence whether we actually step up and help?
Oh, there are many, and they're quite powerful. One key factor is situational ambiguity.
Meaning, if it's unclear whether help is needed.
Right. Is that person slumped on the bench sick or just sleeping? Are those people yelling, playing around, or is it a real fight? If the situation is ambiguous, people are much less likely to intervene because they fear misinterpreting it and potentially embarrassing themselves.
That makes sense. What else?
Naturally, the perceived cost of helping matters. This includes risk, time, effort, even financial cost. The likelihood of helping generally increases as the perceived cost or risk declines. We're more likely to give someone directions than jump into a dangerous fight.
Okay. And then there's the really famous counterintuitive factor.
Yes. Diffusion of responsibility. This is the core psychological mechanism behind the well-known bystander effect.
Explain that again.
The bystander effect is the finding that the presence of other people, other bystanders, actually reduces the likelihood that any single individual will help someone in need.
So more people around means less chance of getting help. That seems backwards.
It does, but the psychology is clear. When multiple people are present, the responsibility to intervene gets psychologically diffused or spread out among all of them. Each person feels less personally responsible, thinking someone else will probably do something or someone else is more qualified.
So everyone waits for someone else to act.
Often, yes. This is why, if you ever witness an emergency, experts advise you not to just yell, "Someone call 911." Instead, you should point directly at one specific person and say, "You in the blue shirt, call 911 now."
That forces individual responsibility back onto them.
Exactly. It breaks the diffusion. Other factors influencing helping include similarity. We're more likely to help those we perceive as similar to us. Empathy, feeling the other person's distress, motivates helping. Our current mood, people in a good mood are generally more likely to help the feel-good, do-good effect.
Interesting about mood. Anything else?
Gender can play a role in who helps and who gets help, often influenced by social norms. For instance, women in need are sometimes more likely to receive help from strangers than men. And one surprising detail from the research, people with so-called baby-faced features, large eyes, round face, tend to elicit more helping behavior.
Baby faces, why?
The theory is that those features might unconsciously trigger perceptions of helplessness, dependence, or harmlessness, which in turn motivates others to offer assistance.
Fascinating. Okay, unfortunately, not all social dynamics are about helping or attraction. We also have to confront the darker side, prejudice and discrimination.
Yes, a critical area. And it's really important, first off, to clearly distinguish between the two terms.
Okay, prejudices.
Prejudice is the preconceived attitude. It's a judgment, usually unfavorable, made about a person based solely on their membership in a particular group before you have any real evidence about them as an individual. It's the prejudgment.
And discrimination.
Discrimination is the behavior. It's the unfair or biased treatment of people based on their group membership. So prejudice is the negative attitude. Discrimination is acting on that attitude, things like denying housing, jobs, or equal opportunities.
And racism is a specific form.
Exactly. Racism is a specific form of prejudice and discrimination directed toward members of other racial groups.
And like other attitudes, prejudice has those three components.
Yes, it fits the ABC model too. The cognitive component involves the biased beliefs and stereotypes you hold about the group. The emotional or affective component involves feelings of dislike, hostility, fear, or contempt toward the group. And the behavioral component is the inclination to discriminate, to avoid, or to act negatively toward members of that group.
What about people who say they aren't prejudiced, but their actions suggest otherwise? You mentioned hidden bias.
Right. This is a really tricky aspect. There's often a significant disparity between what people explicitly say about their attitudes toward certain groups, often claiming to be unprejudiced, and how they might implicitly or unconsciously respond to cues associated with those groups.
Like what kind of cues or responses?
Subtle things. Maybe unconsciously clutching a bag tighter when a member of a stereotyped group sits nearby. Maybe slightly more hesitation in promoting someone from that group. Maybe nonverbal cues like less eye contact or a more closed body posture. These automatic responses can reveal an underlying, hidden negative association rooted in stereotypes, even if the person consciously rejects prejudice.
And this speaks to how powerful and automatic stereotypes are.
Absolutely. They function as those cognitive shortcuts we talked about earlier. And once they're established, often through cultural learning, they become incredibly resistant to change. They can persist even when a person is consciously trying hard to be fair and objective.
So where do these deeply ingrained biases actually come from? What's the origin?
Well, a fundamental starting point seems to be our basic human cognitive tendency to categorize the social world. We naturally divide people into us and them, or in social psychology terms, into in-groups, groups we belong to and identify with, and out-groups, groups we don't belong to.
Just the act of categorizing starts the process.
It seems to. This simple act of categorization then triggers several forms of biased thinking that directly feed prejudice.
Okay, what are those biases?
First, there's outgroup negativism. This is the tendency to attribute more negative characteristics and fewer positive characteristics to people in the outgroups compared to people in our in-group.
We see them more negatively.
Right. Second, and relatedly, is in-group favoritism. This is the flip side. We tend to attribute more positive characteristics like competence, warmth, and even moral integrity to members of our own group. We see us more positively.
Okay, negativity towards them, favoritism towards us. What's the third?
The third is really damaging to understanding and empathy, outgroup homogeneity.
Homogeneity, meaning seeing them as all the same.
Exactly. It's the tendency to perceive members of outgroups as being much more similar to each other, they're all alike, than members of one's own group. We readily recognize the diversity, the individuality, the different personalities and opinions within our in-group, but we paint the outgroup with a broad, uniform brush.
And that strips them of their individuality.
Completely. It makes it easier to stereotype them and harder to empathize with them as unique human beings.
So, given how deep-rooted these tendencies are, categorization, in-group favoritism, out-group homogeneity, can we actually reduce prejudice? Is there hope?
Well, there's hope, but it's challenging. Gordon Allport's famous contact hypothesis proposed that increased intergroup contact can reduce prejudice and tension. But, and this is crucial only under specific optimal conditions.
Just putting groups together isn't enough.
No, contact alone isn't a magic bullet. In fact, hostile or superficial contact can actually make prejudice worse. For contact to be effective in reducing prejudice, Allport and later researchers identified several key conditions that generally need to be met.
Okay, what are those conditions?
First, you need institutional support. Authorities, laws, and social norms must explicitly support the integration and equality between the groups. It can't just be grassroots. The system has to endorse it.
Right.
Second, there need to be opportunities for members of the different groups to really get acquainted on a personal level, to interact informally and discover common ground beyond just group labels.
Makes sense. Third,
and this is very important, the contact situation should involve equal status between the members of the group's meeting. If one group has power or status over the other during the interaction, it's likely to reinforce stereotypes rather than reduce them.
Okay, institutional support, acquaintance potential, equal status. What's the last one?
The fourth key condition is cooperative effort toward a shared goal. The groups need to work together, depend on each other, to achieve a common objective that requires their combined effort.
Like working on a team project together.
Exactly. That kind of interdependence forces people to see members of the other group as individuals with useful skills, and it helps transform the dynamic from us versus them to a single we focused on succeeding at the task. When these conditions are met, contact can be a powerful tool for reducing prejudice. But meeting all of them consistently is often the challenge in real-world settings.
Definitely sounds challenging. Okay, our last topic in this section on interactions is aggression, the roots of harmful behavior.
Yes, aggression is another complex phenomenon with no single simple cause. It's truly multi-causal.
What are some of the different perspectives on where it comes from?
Well, we see influences from multiple levels. There are biological factors, things like genetics. Some people may have a predisposition, hormonal influences like the role of testosterone, though it's complex, and neurotransmitter levels in the brain can all play a role in regulating baseline aggression levels.
Okay, so biology isn't destiny, but it's a factor. What else?
Then there are powerful social cognitive perspectives. These emphasize that aggression is often learned behavior.
Learned how?
Through reinforcement. If being aggressive gets you what you want, you're more likely to do it again. And crucially, through observational learning or modeling, simply watching others behave aggressively, whether it's parents, peers, or characters in the media, can teach individuals that aggression is an acceptable or effective way to behave. Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiments famously demonstrated this.
Right, so biological and learned components. What about broader society?
Absolutely. Sociocultural factors are huge. Broader social stressors like poverty, exposure to community violence, family breakdown, experiences of abuse or neglect, these kinds of environmental pressures can generate chronic frustration, anger, and stress, which in turn can increase the likelihood of aggressive expression.
So a mix of internal and external factors. Are there any other specific influences?
Yes, immediate emotional states are critical. Feelings of frustration when a goal is blocked, and anger are strong triggers for aggression. And even simple environmental influences can matter. For instance, research consistently links high temperatures, heat waves, to increased rates of aggression, irritability, and even violent crime.
Really? Heat makes people more aggressive. Why?
The leading theory is that uncomfortable heat induces physical arousal and negative feelings, which can generate angry, hostile thoughts. These thoughts then prime aggressive behaviors, making people more likely to lash out in response to provocations they might otherwise ignore.
Okay, we've looked at how we see individuals and interact one-on-one, or in terms of broad group biases. Now let's really focus on the power of the immediate group. How does being part of a collective influence us as individuals, starting with our sense of self?
Right. Our social or group identity actually forms a critical part of our overall self-concept, how we define who we are.
We usually think of identity as personal, right?
Yeah.
Unique to us.
We do, and that's part of it. We define ourselves via two lenses, really. There's our personal identity, that sense of ourselves as unique individuals with our own specific traits, abilities, preferences, and personal history.
Okay, and the other lens.
Is our social identity.
Yeah.
This is our sense of self derived from the groups we belong to and identify with our nationality, our ethnicity, our religion, our occupation, our political affiliation, even the teams we support. I am an American. I am a doctor. I am a Cubs fan.
And the balance between these two shifts.
Dramatically, often based on culture. As we touched on earlier, social identity, defining yourself by your group memberships and roles, is generally far more prominent and central to the self-concept in collectivist cultures. Group belonging is paramount.
Whereas in individualistic cultures,
The personal identity typically takes precedence. Who you are as a unique individual is emphasized more. But, and this is important even in individualistic cultures, that fundamental psychological need to belong, to be part of groups, is still incredibly powerful. And that leads us directly towards conformity.
conforming to the group. What does that mean precisely in psychological terms?
Conformity is basically adjusting one's behavior or attitudes or beliefs to align them more closely with actual or perceived social pressures. These pressures can come from broad societal norms, don't pick your nose in public, or specific peer group norms, everyone in our group wears this brand.
And the power of this pressure was famously shown by
Solomon Asch, in his classic line judgment studies from the 1950s, these are really foundational experiments in social psychology.
Remind us how those work.
Asch brought participants into a lab, supposedly for a study on visual perception. They were seated around a table with several other people who were actually Confederates, actors working for Asch.
Yeah.
They were shown cards with lines on them. One card had a standard line, and another card had 3 comparison lines of different length. The task was incredibly simple. Just say out loud which of the 3 comparison lines matched the standard line. The correct answer was always obvious.
An easy task.
Yeah.
What was the twist?
The twist was that on certain critical trials, all the Confederates, one by one, deliberately gave the same, clearly wrong answer before it was the real participants' turn to respond.
So the participant heard a whole group unanimously saying something that contradicted their own eyes.
Exactly. Asch, and most people at the time, wrongly predicted that participants would trust their own judgment and resist conforming to such an obviously false group consensus.
That's not what happened.
Not at all. The results were stunning, almost legendary for how bleak they seemed about human independence. About 3/4, 75% of the participants conformed to the incorrect group judgment at least once during the critical trials. Many conformed on multiple trials.
Wow. 3 out of 4 went along with an obviously wrong answer at least once, just because the group did?
Yes. It illustrated this profound, often uncomfortable willingness we have to bend our individual judgment, our I, to fit in with the we, even when the we is demonstrably wrong.
Why? Why did they conform? Did Asch ask them?
He did. People gave several reasons, falling into 2 main categories of social influence. Some conformed because they assumed the majority must be correct, that maybe their own perception was flawed. This is called informational social influence. They looked to the group for information about reality.
Okay. Doubting their own judgment. What was the other reason?
The other major reason was concern about group acceptance and avoiding social rejection or ridicule. This is normative social influence. They didn't want to stand out, be the lone dissenter, or disrupt the group harmony. They knew the group was wrong, but they went along anyway to fit in.
Or maybe they just figured it was easier.
That too. Some likely just calculated that it was simpler and less awkward to just go along with the flow rather than cause a fuss over a line judgment. And Ash also found that situational factors mattered. For instance, conformity dropped dramatically if the participant had just one other person, another Confederate, break from the majority and give the correct answer. Having an ally made a huge difference. Also, having to state your response publicly increased conformity compared to writing it down privately.
Okay, so conformity is about aligning your behavior or beliefs with the group norm. What about compliance? How is that different?
Compliance is more specific. It's about acceding to a direct request or demand made by others. It's not just fitting in with a general norm. It's doing something because someone asked you to or told you to, though that edges towards obedience. This is really the domain of sales, fundraising, and sometimes manipulation.
And what makes us comply with requests?
Compliance seems to hinge on several powerful psychological principles or determinants. Things like our deep-seated need for cognitive consistency, wanting our actions to align with our commitments, our tendency towards social validation, doing what others are doing, the powerful norm of reciprocity, feeling obligated to repay favors or concessions, and our perceptions of the requester's authority or status.
And salespeople and others exploit these needs.
Ruthlessly, sometimes. They've developed specific techniques designed to leverage these psychological tendencies to increase compliance.
Okay, let's break down some of those classic manipulative sales tactics mentioned in the sources. The first one is the lowball technique. What's that?
The lowball works by first getting you to agree to a request under favorable conditions, say, agreeing to buy a car at a really attractive, low advertised price.
Okay, sounds good so far.
Right. But after you've made that initial commitment, after you've mentally bought the car, the salesperson comes back and says, "Oh, sorry, my manager didn't approve that price." Or they start revealing hidden costs, mandatory fees, expensive necessary add-ons that weren't mentioned up front. These dramatically raise the ultimate price you have to pay.
Ah, so they hook you with the low price, then raise it. Why do people agree to the higher price?
Because of that need for consistency,
Yeah.
You've already psychologically committed to buying that car. You've invested time. Maybe you've imagined driving it. Backing out now would create dissonance. So often people feel compelled to follow through and pay the higher price, even though they wouldn't have agreed to it initially.
Sneaky. Okay, what about the bait and switch technique?
This is somewhat similar, but slightly different. It relies on luring you in with an unrealistically attractive offer, the bait. Maybe it's an advertised product at an unbelievably low price.
Okay, the bait gets me in the store.
Exactly. But when you get there, you find out the advertised item is conveniently sold out, or maybe it's of much lower quality than expected. Then the salesperson immediately tries to sell you a different, less attractive, usually more expensive alternative, the switch. They baited you with one thing but intend to sell you another.
Got it. Next up, the foot in the door technique. This one sounds familiar.
It's very common. This technique works by getting someone to agree to a small, trivial, easy request. There's something they're almost certain to say yes to.
Like signing a harmless petition. Or putting a small sticker in their window.
Exactly. Once you've secured compliance with that small request, you've got your foot in the door, you then follow up maybe later with a much larger related request, the one you really wanted all along, like asking for a significant donation or asking them to volunteer time.
And the initial small act makes them more likely to agree to the big one.
Yes, significantly more likely. Again, it taps into the need for consistency. Complying with the small request changes the person's self-perception slightly. I'm the kind of person who supports this cause. Refusing the larger request later would then be inconsistent with that new self-image, creating dissonance.
Clever. Okay, and finally, the mirror image. The door-in-the-face technique. How does that work?
This one starts in the opposite direction. You begin by making a massive, extreme, unreasonable request, one that the target is almost guaranteed to refuse, to slam the door in your face.
Like asking a stranger for a $500 donation,
Right.
or asking someone to volunteer every weekend for a year.
Exactly. Something clearly over the top. Once they inevitably refuse that large request, you immediately retreat and follow up with a much smaller, more reasonable request, the one you were actually aiming for. Maybe asking for just a $10 donation or volunteering for just one afternoon.
And why does that work?
This technique primarily leverages the norm of reciprocity. When you back down from your large initial request to a smaller one, you appear to have made a concession. The target then feels a social obligation to reciprocate your concession by meeting you halfway and agreeing to your second, smaller request. It feels like a compromise, even though it was manipulated.
These are all quite cunning ways to get people to say yes.
They really are. Understanding them helps you recognize when they might be being used on you.
Okay, so while compliance is about acceding to requests, there's a stronger form, obedience.
Yes. Obedience is specifically compliance with the demands or orders issued by people who are perceived to be in positions of legitimate authority.
And this brings us inevitably to the work of Stanley Milgram.
Indeed. Milgram's research on obedience to authority is probably some of the most famous and controversial in all of psychology.
What was he trying to understand?
Milgram began his work in the early 1960s, heavily influenced by the Holocaust. He explicitly wanted to investigate the psychological dynamics of obedience to understand how seemingly ordinary German citizens could have participated in, or passively allowed, the horrific atrocities committed under the Nazi regime. Could something like that happen anywhere?
So he designed an experiment to test obedience in a lab setting.
He did. His basic setup involved bringing participants, recruited through newspaper ads, thinking it was a study on memory and learning, into a Yale University lab. They were introduced to another supposed participant, actually a Confederate, Mr. Wallace, and an experimenter in a gray lab coat, the authority figure.
Okay.
Through a rigged draw, the real participant was always assigned the role of teacher, and the Confederate was the learner. The learner was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room, supposedly connected to an electric shock generator controlled by the teacher.
And the teacher's job
was to read word pairs to the learner and then test the learner's memory. For every wrong answer the learner gave, the teacher was instructed by the experimenter to administer an electric shock, starting at a low 15 volts and increasing by 15 volts for each subsequent error, up to a maximum of 450 volts, labeled XXX danger, severe shock.
But the shocks weren't real, right?
No, the shocks weren't real. The learner, the Confederate, was acting, following a preset script of grunts, protests, complaints about a heart condition, screams of agony, and eventually ominous silence as the supposed voltage increased.
So the real focus was on the teacher, the actual participant. Would they obey the experimenter's commands to keep administering shocks, even when the learner seemed to be in extreme distress?
Exactly. The experimenter used a series of standardized prods if the teacher hesitated. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue, and you have no other choice. You must go on.
What did Milgram find? What was the level of obedience?
The findings shocked Milgram himself and the world. Psychiatrists he surveyed beforehand predicted that only a tiny fraction, maybe 1%, the sadistic fringe would go all the way to 450 volts.
But the reality was?
The reality was that in the main version of the study, a staggering 65%, nearly two-thirds of the participants obeyed the experimenter's commands and administered the shocks all the way up to the maximum 450 volts, even though many showed signs of extreme stress and conflict while doing so.
65%. Ordinary people went all the way.
Ordinary people from various walks of life, teachers, engineers, laborers. It was a chilling demonstration of the power of authority in the situation to compel behavior that likely went against the participants' own moral values.
Why is this research considered so important?
Well, fundamentally, it provides a powerful, albeit disturbing, lens for understanding how behavior can be dramatically shaped by situational context and the presence of perceived legitimate authority. It potentially helps explain how ordinary people, not just evil individuals, can become involved in carrying out actions in real-world situations like wars or genocides that seem inexplicable or horrifying in retrospect.
But the studies were also incredibly controversial, weren't they?
Extremely controversial, and for good reason. Ethically, they raised huge concerns. Critics questioned the intense psychological stress placed on the participants, many of whom were deeply disturbed by their own actions during the debriefing. The extensive deception involved was also heavily criticized.
Right. The participants thought they were actually hurting someone.
They did, and that realization that they were capable of such obedience could have had lasting negative emotional after effects for some. Furthermore, some critics questioned the generalizability. How much can you really extrapolate from this artificial, high-pressure lab situation to complex, real-life atrocities like the Holocaust?
So the ethical fallout was significant.
Absolutely. Milgram's work, along with other controversial studies around that time, was a major catalyst for the development and strengthening of ethical guidelines in psychological research.
That's a key detail. His work directly spurred the American Psychological Association and other bodies to implement the rigorous ethical codes we have today, emphasizing informed consent, minimizing harm, allowing withdrawal, and thorough debriefing to protect human participants.
Yes, that's a crucial part of its legacy. His findings were profound, but the methods pushed ethical boundaries in ways that shaped future research practices immensely.
Okay, so understanding why that high level of obedience occurred is key. What factors did Milgram and others point to?
Several factors seemed critical. One core reason is the legitimization of authority. We are socially conditioned from a very early age to obey authority figures. Parents, teachers, police officers, doctors, scientists, and lab coats, often without seriously questioning the validity or morality of their demands. The experimenter at Yale carried immense perceived authority.
Okay, respect for authority.
Yeah.
Yes.
Another factor is likely social validation. In ambiguous or stressful situations, people often look to others, especially authority figures, for cues on how to behave. If the experimenter remained calm and insistent, the participant might infer that the situation must be okay, that the behavior must be appropriate, despite the learner's screams.
Using the authority figure's reaction as a guide.
Right. And finally, similar to the foot-in-the-door technique we discussed for compliance, the incremental nature of the requests was probably critical. Participants didn't start by giving a 450-volt shock. They started with a tiny, seemingly harmless 15-volt shock. Their willingness to comply with the extreme requests later likely increased because they'd already committed to the path by complying with the series of lesser, gradually escalating requests. Each step made the next one seem less discontinuous.
A gradual erosion of resistance.
Exactly. It's much harder to draw the line halfway through than it is right at the beginning.
Okay, that helps explain those disturbing findings. To wrap up this section on group influence, let's quickly look at how the mere presence of others affects our individual performance when we're working on tasks.
Right. There are actually two distinct, almost opposing phenomena that can occur here, depending on the situation and the task.
What's the first one?
The first is social facilitation. This is the tendency, first observed over a century ago, to perform better or work harder on certain tasks when other people are present compared to when you're alone.
So an audience helps performance.
Sometimes. But it's moderated by task difficulty. The presence of others seems to increase physiological arousal. This heightened arousal enhances performance on simple, well-learned tasks. Things like reeling in a fishing line faster or running faster if you're a good runner. Things you can do almost automatically.
But what about complex tasks?
That's where it flips. That same arousal caused by the presence of others actually impairs performance on complex, novel, or difficult tasks. Things that require concentration and careful thought, like solving a complex math problem or learning a new skill. The arousal interferes with the necessary focus. So, an audience helps on easy tasks, but hurts on hard ones.
Interesting. And what's the opposing phenomenon?
The opposing force is social loafing. This is the tendency for individuals to expend less effort when they are working collectively as part of a group compared to when they are working alone on the same task.
People slack off in groups. Why?
Several reasons. They might feel their individual contribution isn't identifiable or won't be evaluated. They might feel their effort isn't essential to the group's success. Or they might just assume others will pick up the slack, so I don't need to try as hard. It's a clear parallel, in a way, to the diffusion of responsibility we talked about, with hoping behavior responsibility for the work gets diffused across the group members.
So, social facilitation is working harder on easy tasks with an audience. Social loafing is working less hard in a group when individual effort isn't monitored.
That's a good summary.
Okay, one last concept here. When groups come together specifically for decision-making, they face another potential pitfall.
Yes, groupthink. This term was coined by Irving Janis.
What is groupthink?
It's a specific tendency that can occur in highly cohesive decision-making groups where the members become so preoccupied with reaching a unanimous consensus and maintaining group harmony that they fail to critically evaluate the information, consider alternatives, or voice dissenting opinions.
So agreement becomes more important than accuracy.
Exactly. The desire for consensus overrides realistic appraisal of alternative courses of action. It leads to flawed decisions because potential problems or counterarguments get suppressed in the interest of group unity.
When is groupthink most likely to happen?
Janis suggested it's more likely under certain conditions. When the group members share a very strong emotional attachment and desire to remain in the group, high cohesiveness. When the group is facing a significant external threat or high stress, or when there's a strong-minded, directive leader who promotes a particular viewpoint and discourages dissent. It becomes a kind of collective effort to avoid conflict and failure, but at the cost of rational and critical thinking. Though it's worth noting, research support for the original model is somewhat mixed, but the general concept remains influential. So we've really covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We went on quite a comprehensive tour.
We certainly did. We started right at the beginning with those rapid, often biased shortcuts we use to judge individuals.
Yeah, our reliance on those potentially inaccurate first impressions, the power of the fundamental attribution error in blaming others' character, and that protective self-serving bias shielding our own egos.
And then we saw how those individual level judgments and biases directly feed into the incredibly powerful forces of the collective.
Mm-hmm. The immense psychological pressure to conform to group norms, even when they're wrong, like in Ash's studies.
And the surprising ease of compliance when faced with clever manipulation techniques.
Right, foot in the door, door in the face.
And of course, that unnerving power of obedience to authority figures, as Milgram so starkly demonstrated.
And these group dynamics, in turn, shape everything from our deepest relationships, attraction, love, to the conditions that foster both altruism and sadly entrenched prejudice and discrimination. It's all interconnected.
Absolutely. So for you listening, hopefully you now possess a richer vocabulary, a better toolkit to identify these subtle cognitive and emotional shortcuts, the often hidden rules of the social game we're all playing.
Yeah, understanding these concepts isn't just, academic. It allows you to be more mindful, to potentially spot when your own judgment might be getting hijacked by, say, a confirmation bias confirming a first impression, or when you might be susceptible to a peripheral cue and a persuasive message.
For me, what really stands out from today's deep dive is the sheer weight of the situation, the context, and the influence of authority figures. It seems they can often overwhelm an individual's personal values or conscience.
It does suggest that our sense of a stable, independent personal identity might be far more fragile, more context-dependent than we typically like to admit, especially when faced with strong social pressure.
Yeah.
And that observation really leads us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. We've seen some powerful evidence today demonstrating just how much external forces, the structure of the situation, the group we're in, the demands of an authority figure, even just the internal discomfort of cognitive dissonance can dictate human action. So if conformity is as prevalent as Ash showed, and obedience can reach the levels Milgram found, and we're constantly adjusting our beliefs just to justify our past decisions and make ourselves feel better, well, it raises a significant and maybe slightly uncomfortable question. When you reflect honestly on the choices you make today, the small ones and the big ones, from what you say in a meeting to who you vote for, how truly confident can you be that your actions were driven purely by your unique, singular, individual convictions?
As opposed to?
As opposed to being driven, perhaps more than you realize, by the invisible but incredibly powerful necessity of harmonizing with the social forces constantly swirling around you.
Were you leading or were you just fitting in?
That is definitely something to chew on. How much is truly me and how much is the we?
Exactly. That's the essence of social psychology, really. And something to think about until our next deep dive.